Bucks are still there. They're one of the oldest teams in the league. And again, for our kind of inferiority complex of like small market franchise, small city, it's like, well, we've been here for 57 years, almost 58 years. And Kareem is a big reason why. And maybe it's because, he had to play with, it's as much as like the NBA was so big man and center oriented, where it's like the next, Bill Russell, Will Chamberlain, George Mikan, Kareem was the next in that kind of lineage. He still needed like an Oscar Robertson. He still needed a Magic Johnson to kind of take that to the next level of winning MVPs, winning titles, being part of dynasties, what have you. And I think, again, it goes back to like, he wasn't this kind of approachable guy for a lot of valid reasons. And that really was tagged on him unfairly, I would say, for a very long time.
When I saw this book kind of scouring Amazon for authors, yours stood out. We just love delving into basketball history. I think a lot of podcasts and mainstream media, it's always caught on to what's happening now, which is relevant. I mean, we live in 2025, but we always want to kind of honor the past and kind of what came before, but lay the building blocks of the game we love today. So with your book, you just go over the creative process of the inspiration for the book and what it took to put the final product together.
Obviously the inspiration to it all was the Bucks winning a title in 2021. I had been covering the Bucks at Behind the Buck Paths. It's like fan sided Milwaukee Bucks site. I had been doing that for like 6 years. I co-host a podcast called Win in Six. We had been doing that for as long as that too. So a lot of things. That was obviously a big moment where everything kind of coalesced together. It's I'd been a Bucks fan and had been writing about it and talking about it for a very long time. And when it came to like Bucks history, I mean, I'm not gonna shock some people. Before Giannis became what we know as Giannis, the Bucks were kind of a lost team, and so we can only look back to the past and really understand that like they were really good for a very long time. And so it's just like going back and reading old stories, just kind of really fascinated. Like the people I was running the site with, my co-host Adam McGee and I, like we. Especially when it was summertime and free agency kind of dries up, it's August, you're looking for things to talk about. It's like, what are we going to talk about? Let's go back in the past and really explore Bucks history. So that was kind of the impetus to everything. And then when the Bucks won the title, I mean, the parallels were obvious. It was 50 years from when they won in 71 to 2021. So that was kind of a nice round number, makes you want to look back. And then from there, it was just kind of like, okay, this is what we're going to be doing. Let's really explore it. And I kind of took the bull by the horns with it all, and what ended up being like a 4-year process of going to the library, getting old Milwaukee Journal, Milwaukee Sentinel articles, because at the time it was two entities. Reading books from the time, not just basketball books, because there are some really good ones, but like stuff about Milwaukee itself. It was so fascinating to me to really look back at the Bucks history, but also it was a really good chance for me to learn more about Milwaukee, about, the city that I live and love, and kind of understand more about why things are the way they are, and how the, a sports team kind of eventually wormed its way in there and kind of captures the heart of the city, eventually.
Can you take our audience into the time period of 1968 to 1975, not only from just a league standpoint, but also just the city of Milwaukee and just how fans in America really viewed basketball at the time, kind of to set the stage for this book, for this franchise to be built and ultimately win the title in 1971?
Well, the NBA, to start with the NBA, it was super fascinating because that's when they start really expanding the league. Like in a 15-year process between like 1966 to 1980. So like it's when the Bulls come in and the Mavericks come in. There's 15 teams that come into the NBA. Some of that's helped by the merger, and I know a lot of people would probably just call it an absorption. And I would agree with that. But that's a lot of teams. That's a lot of teams. It's basically one a year. And I know like consensus would say, I feel like a lot of people, like if you listen to Bill Simmons, a lot of people that look at NBA history, they look at it post-merger. And obviously, selfishly, I would say you're kind of missing the boat. You're kind of missing some of the stories there. I mean, I understand like the Celtics had a they had every title under the sun for a while there, but it really is, you kind of see the growing pains of the league, but you're missing like the guys that helped pave the way to what we know what it is now. And fortunately, a lot of them were on the Bucks when they eventually came into the league. So that's that part of it. Milwaukee itself was in a very fascinating place. They had the Milwaukee Braves. They win the World Series in 1957. I went back and read a lot of Braves books because it's really fascinating. But they moved to Atlanta after the 1965 MLB season. So there's no pro sports in Milwaukee. There's the Green Bay Packers, and they're winning titles. They're a dynasty in their own right, but it's not Milwaukee. And so there's always this kind of inferiority complex that Bucks fans have. I don't know if you've seen it online, but when it comes to like a sports franchise, sports team, maybe even their superstars, we're a little protective of that. And I think it's because we know that these things can be taken away. So that I understood those things at the time. Like I understood that the Braves were a thing, and now the Brewers are their own MLB team. But when I really dove into everything and kind of looked at like this is why made it was such a big thing for the Bucks to come into the league and be awarded an expansion franchise because the Braves had left, and Milwaukee really kind of at the time triumphed that they were kind of big league, major league again. So that starts in 1968, and then it's 14 months later they get Kareem. So it's like kind of on a rocket ship of all these things are coming out of seemingly nowhere, and then all of a sudden they're top of the NBA as little, or it was growing at the time, but as little as it was at that time. So it's such a really fascinating part from that point on, and then culminates in winning the championship in 3 years, which is just crazy. It really is crazy to think about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think first of all, shout out to you having to go back and do research, and for the young people listening, most cities used to have two newspapers, um, uh,
Yeah.
which is no longer the case, and we're much the poorer for it. I grew up with the Houston Post and the Houston Chronicle, so it was, that was the thing. So kudos for bringing that up. I think it's a good reminder for people for, journalistic purposes. We getting back to something like that would be really good. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I think what I really find fascinating, I found a lot of things fascinating about the approach that you took, because I think uh, kind of taking the history of the times and interweaving it with the story of the Bucks and the story of the city of Milwaukee, I have found to be very, very interesting. Uh, Particularly when you look at if you look at, say, like 1960s compared to, say, like 2020, when the Bucks were also at the forefront of some social justice initiatives after, with the in the bubble, making the decision to not play, um,
Yeah.
due to the George Floyd protests that were going on in Milwaukee. Um, and I just find it interesting that you really kind of looked at the inception of the Bucks franchise and how it tied into the social justice protests that were going on at that time, the civil rights era, and I mean, even tying in Kareem's faith, and then the how there was breaks with the Nation of Islam, and how it kind of all of that kind of stuff. What was kind of, as you were looking through that and researching it, what was the thing that stood out to you that was the most surprising thing that you learned as you were kind of looking at that early history, and how, and anything that kind of tied in and was comparable to what happened in 2020 and is ongoing today?
It's super fascinating. That is a great question. Because there's so many things that I was really fascinated with. Honestly, Kareem himself just kind of fascinates me. I think part of why I wanted to go to 1975 is to cover him leaving, because that is ultimately as big of a story, if not bigger, than the Bucks winning the championship in a lot of ways, because he sets the groundwork and sets the path of a superstardom, at least in a Milwaukee sense. But it's also looking at a guy that he's a legend of the game. He comes into, like, we know what fame and fortune comes for all these guys now, but at the time, like, it's not really known. Like, it's again, it's a different time, it's a different era. There's 3 channels on TV compared to however many now in streaming services. But the fact that he was well known as like a high school basketball player in 1965 is kind of astounding when that wasn't a thing. So, like, he is, in a lot of ways, like, you could talk about Kareem in the sense of race, obviously. You could talk about him in the sense of celebrity. You could talk about how this in the sense of basketball being covered at the time. And it's not just Kareem, but he's such a big example of, there's a lot of things that you can associate him with from that era of the NBA, and it's growing in stature. The same could be applied to Oscar Robertson. There's a lot of weight to those issues and topics that I wasn't prepared to talk about or to really explore. But the more I went further with this, it's like, I see the responsibility to share that. And Milwaukee itself, like, at the time, it's, the Bucks get awarded a franchise in January. I think the official date's like January 22nd, 1968. A couple months later, before that, is like the riots. There's open housing marches. It's such an interesting, all these things are happening in this pod, and it's kind of coming to a boil. And I think that was such a proper way to look at, where these players are coming into, these cities that they're coming into, and they're trying to be a part of society and be covered in a very respectful manner that, it's wasn't that way in the same way that we look at athletes now. And Kareem, I think, was as maybe the biggest example of that, because he was so young and coming into that and trying to be the voice to all these things that I think a lot of people, I know a lot of people at the time were just not willing to accept.
Jordan, you mentioned with Kareem that he was well known in high school. And that pops into my mind just with LeBron, and particularly, a lot of success when he was in high school. With Kareem in particularly, can you kind of go over kind of his national profile as him as a high school athlete to the rest of the nation? What was that like in terms of the expectations of him going to college and then his pro career?
Well, I know the biggest thing, and I think even probably his documentary on HBO covered it, of like, he had a choice to go to St. John's, stay in New York, go to UCLA. I believe there's even I'm trying to place where it is, if it's like in a couple of his autobiographies, but somewhere along the way, the University of Michigan kind of pops in the picture, but that's obviously not where he ends up. But he goes to UCLA, and that's the start of their dynasty. That's the start of UCLA really making a name for itself in sports, in basketball, John Wooden, all that stuff. But in a big way, it's Kareem. And so I know I don't think I talk about it in the book, but there's like all the kind of legendary stories of, this is during the time when college freshmen weren't even playing for the varsity team. They had junior varsity teams at the time, and Kareem's freshman team beat UCLA's varsity team when he got there, which is like, that's crazy. Uh, but they go like 88-2 in his 3 years when he's playing there, which again, success was so a part of his story at such an early age that, frankly, what we'd call tanking in the NBA now, the Bucks founders really strategically knew that if they landed Kareem, that meant they would cement themselves as a franchise. So at 22 years old, that is kind of like put on his shoulders of, you're coming to our team, you're coming to our town, and we kind of expect the world once you come here. And again, this is a modern lens of looking at it, that's a lot to expect for anybody, even as good as someone like Kareem was in eventually got there. I shouldn't say eventually. He quickly got there in his first season, but that's just a lot of pressure on a guy that is trying to learn more about himself and really, all these things are coming at him at a very fast and furious pace. May not be as fast as it is now, but I can only imagine what he was thinking at those times and as he was getting older and trying to, be more than just an athlete, be more than just an NBA player, because that is so baked into his story as a human being, really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about like him in Milwaukee, and then being Muslim, so he doesn't drink beer. He maybe doesn't like cheese curd that much. So what is there, what, what is there to do in the Milwaukee? And so that's, I think you bring that up as like a struggle, and I wonder, kind of like, again, transposing to modern era, is that a thing that continues to be an issue with someone like a Giannis, or is that perception of Milwaukee changed in the intervening years?
I think some cases it has, some cases it hasn't. Frankly, I think Giannis is the type of guy, if we're kind of making comparisons, he's kind of a guy that really doesn't chase those things. In terms of like stature, celebrity stature. I mean, again, it's a very different time frame too that we're talking about, where not all Bucks games are on TV. These guys are way more elevated by social media apps, but how sports programming has evolved over the time too. It's hard to kind of draw those parallels, but I know, I mean, Giannis repeatedly has made it known that he's comfortable in Milwaukee and wants to live there. And the biggest difference in any kind of like talk about Giannis's future in Milwaukee versus Kareem's, it's always been about, I think now those conversations are about competitive reasons for Giannis. Whereas with Kareem, it's about, he was fine playing for the Bucks. It's about living in Milwaukee. And those are two different distinctions that, if I'm being honest with some Bucks fans too, I think they have to kind of come to those grips as well. But in some ways, I feel like we're evolved past that. In some ways, Milwaukee itself, it's, I love living here, but you acknowledge the faults of what could be better and what can be better. And I think as much as there's been progress, I mean, this is life. It's in itself. Things can be a lot better than what they can always be.
Yeah, no, I get that. I love the dichotomy. I mean, Kareem's looking for jazz bars, and Milwaukee is there. If it's the early '70s, they're maybe playing a lot of Cheap Trick. It's
FM radio.
yeah, yeah. So I definitely see kind of where you're going for with that, and it makes a lot. I mean, it absolutely makes sense. That sometimes there's a culture shock, with like players in places that, I mean, particularly coming from like LA to Milwaukee can be kind of a culture shock for some people back then. I mean, nowadays I think most large cities are very similar.
Yeah.
Have become very homogenized, but I think back then it was a different feel. It was a very unique city, in both cases. So
Well, and obviously, like, I'm 33 years old. I was not watching the Bucks then. I was not obviously alive. So I think in one ways you can kind of look at that as like a negative, or something that you can't, in the process of writing this book, is kind of an obstacle. But that made me want to go further and kind of explore those kind of things, because, there's some good Bucks books out there, but if we're talking about books written at the time, there are a lot of them, if not all of them, are out of print. You have to go on eBay, you're searching for them. And that's what kind of made me want to go into like more of the sociological, societal stuff about that, because in my mind, they're so intertwined with how we view sports and why it legitimizes cities. I mean, if we're being honest now, like, this is how to differentiate yourself. You could say, we have the Bucks here, we have this team here, and that, the Milwaukee is known for a lot of things and famous for his beer, obviously, but that could be said for a lot of other different cities at this point. So losing those trademarks or trying to find those trademarks are a lot different nowadays than I would say even maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So that's part of the process that I kind of came to love as time wore on.
I I wanted to just touch on another thing I thought was interesting too, and sorry for dominating, Justin. But
You're
uh,
good.
um, it's almost the book also reads almost like a celebration of Larry Costello, who I think has been kind of forgotten. And um, you know, I Larry coming over to coach the Bucks is the equivalent to me of like, let's say Seattle got a team this year and Damian Lillard went over there to be a player coach for them, and so he's injured his
Yeah.
first year as a player coach, and then he's suiting up and tying the laces. So what kind of made you? What did you learn about Larry? Were you familiar with him before kind of diving into this, or was this like a first time being exposed to him as a coach and player?
I had been very familiar. I mean, that was part of the fun, our Bucks history months at Behind the Book Passes, that we'd look at figures, we'd look at coaches. I mean, has the second most wins in franchise history behind Don Nelson. And so when you win a championship that kind of already attracts so much attention, in terms of like franchise history, but when you couple in the fact that he's the first coach, he stayed for a very long time. He you have Kareem, you have Oscar, you have Wayne Embry, who becomes the first black GM in all of North American sports. And then there's Larry Costello, who's kind of anything that you read about him, he they always they always refer to as like crew cut, his kind of this old fashioned coach. He you know I did it was kind of this trial run before the book came out, but when he got enshrined in the Hall of Fame, I did this audio essay on our podcast. And this is, I'm knee deep in the research of all this stuff, and I'm going through all these Larry Costello things, and it was so interesting. And I think at the time there was I don't know how much video was out there, but after he got into the Hall of Fame, they have a video of him and they show him shooting a shot. And I'd always read about he's the last like set shooter. And you see it, and it's like, holy cow! Like it's like, again, this is a totally different game. And he came into the league when there wasn't even a 24-second shot clock, which, like, when you read stuff like that, it's like we're talking about a different sport. You know what I mean? Like that's like playing at the Wire, LA Fitness kind of level of playing it. So yeah, it's just like he's so fascinating. He kind of comes with this like kind of drill sergeant attitude, but the results are there, and it's like, again, to go back to like the dichotomy of all these the cast of characters from around that time. And I just have a soft spot for him because he kind of, once he resigns from the Bucks in early 76 77 season, paves the way for Don Nelson, kind of loses his shot. He was the coach of the Milwaukee Does at one point before they folded in the Women's Basketball League. And then he had coached the Bulls before that, but then goes back to like Utica College, and then it's like it's kind of over. So it was another chance for me to kind of look at a coach that was highly successful, and just a bygone era of a different time. But I couldn't help but not tell a story in the way that other people were telling it at the time.
What was the dynamic between Kareem and Oscar Robertson? We've seen over the years in NBA history, when you have two alphas that are going to be future Hall of Famers, the dynamics could be different. It varies throughout not only the NBA but sports. So, through your research, what was their dynamic like on and off the court?
It was very kind of like, I it wasn't a problem. I think part of it was Kareem kind of found an equal. I shouldn't say kind of. He found an equal. He found someone that was willing to kind of keep people in line, kind of not a taskmaster, but Oscar was willing to dish it out if people weren't running the right play or weren't giving effort. And Kareem is a much more kind of introspective guy, whereas like Oscar is that, but also he'll tell you like it is. He won't beat around the bush. Every anecdote, you mean, I love his biography, and you just read about it, and it's, it's a guy that has to get a lot of things off his chest for a long time, and rightly so. Um, but a lot of the talk, it's so interesting because I think you can make some parallels to today where, the Bucks, the first year that they have Kareem, they win 56 games after winning 27 the year before. They lose to the Knicks in the playoffs, and then hours later, there's reports about, oh, they traded for Oscar Robertson. So it's like such a response to, what was a good season but a stinging defeat. And Oscar comes in, and it really brought in just this respectability that they needed at that time to take that next step forward. And, it was 4 years, and Oscar Robertson wasn't the triple double master that we know of him at, when he was with the Royals. But I think for them, it brought a level of kind of just like assertiveness and just something that they needed to kind of get over the hump. And obviously they did, in his first season in Milwaukee.
Go ahead, Alan, if you have another question.
Oh, I was just going to ask. So, who was Kareem traded for? Because I love the answer to that question.
Junior Bridgman, Brian Winters. I'm like fumbling over these names, even though I know them by heart. David Myers, and Elmore Smith.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because that's one of those trades that I think. I mean, I always think that trades usually work out well for both teams eventually, or in the moment. That's one of the ones where it was like, that's really not a great return, but it's, if he wanted to leave, so that's what. So, and the book, you end the book with kind of that going on, but in your research, how far did, I mean, obviously, I mean, it set Milwaukee back. They went from a contender to, to not a contender. Uh, what effect did that have on the city of Milwaukee to kind of lose Kareem and that sense of like any year they could win it?
I think it happened so fast that, reading even like, I don't know if it was reflected in just the city, but I think it was certainly reflected in ownership at the time. Which, big part of this is that the Bucks, when they are first come together, they sell stock in the team. So they have a board of directors. There's no one owner. At the time, I know I'm forgetting which other teams, but it kind of comes into vogue during the 70s, and by the late 70s, the Bucks are one of two teams left that has some kind of operation like that. Don't quote me on that, but just reading stuff like that where there's no one owner that can kind of, it takes a lot of people to be in agreement or in agreement on, trading a superstar. And that's where like a guy like Wayne Embry came into the picture, where the Bucks were so good for such a long time. Their draft picks weren't good. The ABA is going on at the time, and they're luring the guys that they have in their draft picks. One of the biggest one is Julius Erving. So to get better, to kind of restock the talent on the roster, they don't have much of any kind of avenue to get better, and they're getting older. So when Kareem submits his trade request, I think, kudos to Wayne Embry to being like, we're not going to fight this. We need to kind of take stock of where we're at and what we think is, this could be, one step back, but can we take two steps forward? And I know it's not covered in the book, probably, hopefully for some future reading, but I know when Marcus Johnson comes to town in 1977, he's the kind of guy that puts everything together. They had a foundation to get better, but the NBA is so superstar driven. So when a guy like Marcus Johnson comes to town, that changed, that eventually got them back on the path to contending for championships.
Final question. This season and then recently, there's been a lot of rumors about the future of Giannis. And if he does leave, what are the consequences to the city of Milwaukee? Do you see any parallels of what happened with Kareem leaving? Or do you think it's kind of a different era due to what happens now in 2025 with just how free agency and picks works and trades and the dynamic of the league now? Do you see any similarities there, or is it kind of apples and oranges if it does lead to Giannis leaving at some point in the future?
It's tough because I think, if you ask any Bucks fan, and if they're being honest about it, he cemented his legacy in Milwaukee with the Bucks. He resuscitated a franchise. He really, we look at sports figures to kind of transcend beyond the court, beyond the field, whatever sport it is. And Giannis himself is his story, even before he came here, is so empowering. And he fought like hell, fought through all sorts of, obstacles to get here in the first place and to get his family here in the first place. That to see him adopt Milwaukee as his home, I don't think that ever goes away. And frankly, I mean, Damian Lillard's not on the team anymore, but Bucks fans, Blazers fans could probably feel the same way. They didn't win a title, but they view him as their own. And it's a hard thing to put on people, but when that happens, it's why you have such an attachment to these players. That I view Kareem in the same way. I don't know if everybody else would feel that way, but the difference is that Giannis would have a statue whenever he leaves Milwaukee, whether that's retirement or not. And Kareem doesn't really have that here. And I think that's a shame because he's still such a massive figure in the world of the NBA and in the Bucks history that, Giannis has his own legacy with that. And I think we've come to an understanding with Kareem that it's, he wasn't long for here for such a long time.
I know we're over time, but do you have time for one more question, Jordan?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so this has always been on my mind. Alan, maybe you can elaborate on this how well. Because with Kareem, you think he's an all-time greatest player in the NBA, but also all-time greatest athlete in sports. But yet his legacy, I don't know, it just feels like he's not as celebrated as other athletes in other sports, let alone the NBA. And I've always wondered why that is. I mean, there's other athletes that have tons of controversies that, they get, like you mentioned, he doesn't have a statue in Milwaukee. I just feel like he's not as heralded, even kind of with the LeBron passing him and the all-time scoring. Like it just, I don't know. It just felt to me like other legends are more heralded than Kareem, and he doesn't get his respect. And I just always wondered that. Just when I've been growing up, I mean, I'm a millennial too, and it was always just a weird dynamic just seeing when you see Kareem honored at all these different events. It just feels weird, and I can't put my finger as to why that is.
I think it's because he lost to Bruce Lee.
That may be part of it. I agree with you. I mean, again, when having done this for as long as I had and kind of, chasing ghosts, but he, in some cases, but with Kareem, you're kind of learning about him as a person. So it's hard not to kind of feel attached to him and kind of see, where he was as, growing, as a human being. So to me, it's like when LeBron passed him in as an all-time scoring leader and kind of these tributes come in, and I think part of it is like this, the NBA is different. The Bucks as a franchise owe a lot to him because, you look at other teams that eventually folded, like the Royals had Oscar Robertson, they traded him away. That team goes under 2 years later. They moved to Kansas City. The Bucks are still there. They're one of the oldest teams in the league. And again, for our kind of inferiority complex of like small market franchise, small city, it's like, well, we've been here for 57 years, almost 58 years. And Kareem is a big reason why. And maybe it's because, he had to play with, it's as much as like the NBA was so big man and center oriented, where it's like the next, Bill Russell, Will Chamberlain, George Mikan, Kareem was the next in that kind of lineage. He still needed like an Oscar Robertson. He still needed a Magic Johnson to kind of take that to the next level of winning MVPs, winning titles, being part of dynasties, what have you. And I think, again, it goes back to like, he wasn't this kind of approachable guy for a lot of, valid reasons. And that really was tagged on him unfairly, I would say, for a very long time. I mean, I watched Winning Time when that was out, and I know a lot of people liked it, but I would argue that was such a caricature of who he was. It kind of takes away the human element of why was Kareem like that? It's baked into our minds of him at the time, or what is written about him and what is said about him, that carries with a lot of players from that time, and Kareem transcends that into some ways, but there are a lot of players that weren't as good as Kareem or didn't play as long as he did that don't have that benefit. And it's a shame for how it is that it takes, years, decades, the league finding itself to kind of eventually get to the point where the things that were maybe said about Kareem, or people just frankly didn't understand him, we don't necessarily view athletes that same way anymore. At least I would hope.
Yeah, no, true. Jordan, thank you very much for the time. Truly appreciate it. Can you let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can find the book, and then any other projects you're working on as well?
Yeah, you can find me on at Jordan Treske on, Blue Sky, Twitter, whatever is left of that at this point. Instagram. I'm a part of I co-host Win in Six podcast. That's our Bucks podcast. We have another Bucks podcast called the Eurostep. It's all on the Eurostep podcast network on Blue Wire. Obviously I have a book called Building the Milwaukee Bucks that's came out yesterday, so it's been a kind of a whirlwind few days here. Oh, there we go. Thank you. That's awesome. That's crazy. I'm so used to seeing it in a Google Doc, so when people show me like physical copies of it, I'm like, oh yeah, like it exists. So, but yeah, I'm hammering away at some other history stuff that I hope will eventually see the light of day. So be on the lookout in maybe a few years.
Cool. Well, we appreciate the time, Jordan. Thank you very much. Good luck on the book. Much success. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.